Okay, so tonight we are looking at collaboration in Revit, and we'll talk about some of the benefits for using collaboration in Revit and how to set it up and administrate it in your own office. So, first of all, one of the reasons that you need to set up collaboration is if you're going to have more than one person working on the file. Now, on the Collaborate tab, you'll find the Collaborate button here, and in your computers it might look a little bit different. It might just say Collaborate at this point. So when you're starting a new project from scratch, it starts off as a single user file. So when I go ahead here and start a new file, on the Collaborate tab, I have this Collaborate button. So if I want to enable more than one person to work on a file at a time, we have to turn on collaboration. So when we hit the button, so here I'm just going to save the file first here. So okay, so you've got two options for collaborating with people on a project. So looking at the top of our notes here, first screenshot on page 1, you can collaborate over your local area network. So you'd use your office's server, or you can collaborate across the internet using Autodesk's internet server for Revit, which works quite well, but it's about $200 per person per month. Ow. So it is costly. So most times, of course, people within an office will just go the process of collaborating over the office. So once you make that choice, the next thing that Revit does is it presents a dialog box to you. Okay, or not. Now we have to go in and start creating work sets for our project. So after you've hit the Collaborate button, then you're going to be in and out of this work sets dialog box. And the easiest analogy that I can use for work sets is layers. It's really like creating a layer in your file. Now I have a completed project here that has a variety of work sets in it. And so in this project, the purpose of work sets really, as you folks will see, is to control the visibility of objects in your view. Now what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the list of work sets in this project. So we've got work sets for the shell of the building and building exterior. We've got work sets for interior walls and doors. We've got work sets for our levels and grids. That comes automatically. We've got a work set for the site, a work set for the structure, and a work set for our below grade structure. Then down below, we've got work sets for things that will only show up in rendering, which we call entourage. Work sets for interior finishes like tiles and other stuff that we don't need to see in our working drawings. And then a work set for sundry stuff for things that will probably be off most of the time. So we've got a work set called invisible. So how do we use these work sets on the average project? Well, on a very large project, it has a lot of interior data. In your exterior elevations, one of the things that you can do once you've got work sets in your project so as soon as work sets have been enabled on a project, when you go to the visibility tab where you normally turn things on and off, you'll now have a tab for your work sets. So then you could hide interior data from your project. And so what this will do is it means that these views will print faster, especially if you have shadows turned on. So if you like to enable shadows when you are printing, as you can see, I've got a little bit of a shadowing in my entry here for the building. If it's a really large project and you've got a lot of geometry, turning off that work set that's got your interior stuff in it will make things go that much faster. So in the context of a new project here, you go into the work sets dialog box and you create the different work sets that you suppose that you will have in your project. And we'll talk about the list of typical work sets that you would use on any given project. Now, step 3, so we're looking at first page of the notes here. This was already a single user file before I entered the work sets dialog box. Once you hit the collaborate button, the next save that you make after you've hit the collaborate button, whether or not you've gone into the work sets dialog box after hitting the collaborate button, the next save after that creates a central file. So that is step 3. So what we would do in that case is the next save of the files, make sure that this document is saved on your office's server so that everyone can get access to it. Then from our collaborate tab here, we would choose sync and modify settings to create the to relinquish all of the work sets in the project. So what I mean is, right now, once you've created a new project, the work sets show you as an owner. Now we're going to talk about what that is in a few moments here. So right now, this is a so here we are creating the central file. So when you hit step 3, Revit will just give you a little warning that you are in fact creating the central file, so that's cool. Now the next thing that it says to do, it says use the sync and modify settings dialog box. So on the collaborate tab, there's 2 options here, sync and synchronize and modify settings. Now they both do the same thing, except synchronize and modify settings pops up a dialog box that you can look at. And so in step 4, it says use the sync and modify settings dialog to relinquish user created work sets so that the team can get started working on this file. So I go ahead and hit OK. Step 5, close the newly created central file. So that's it. I'm out of that newly created central file. Now you folks will notice that now when I go to the open dialog box and I go to open up that project, what does Revit want to do? It wants to create a new local file of that project that I started. Now we're just going to go back here and do a little bit of a rehash on how central files work. Okay, so once you've created your central file as per step 3, and so this central file is sitting on your server. So I'll just draw it as a little simplified icon in the tower here. So there's your central file, and it has whatever name you give it, .rbt. So this file is sitting on your server, and we call it the central file. So this is where everybody's going to save their work on a regular basis. You know, every 10 minutes or so, people are going to be updating this Revit database. Now, as you folks saw, when I was in the Revit Open Dialog, and I went to open this file, there was that little checkbox. Right here, create new local. What does that mean? Well, it means that when you go to open up your central file on your server after it's been created, Revit doesn't directly open the central file. What it does instead is it copies that database to your own computer. It's an exact copy of it. So this goes on your workstation, and you get an exact copy of the file that Revit puts typically into your documents folder on your workstation. And then what it does is it adds an underscore to the file name and then puts in your Revit username, which will show. It's in options. Typically what Revit does is it gets your username from Windows and puts your Windows username in after the underscore. So it's still a Revit file, so it'll still have that RVT extension on the end if Windows has been configured on your machine to show those extensions. So we call this thing the local file. And it's the file that you actually are working on at any given moment. So when you're collaborating with people in your office, you are not directly working on the central file. You're working on your local file. Revit copies it the first time that you open up your project, copies it to your computer. So now what? Well, now you will have two buttons. So in Revit here, I'm going to open up my new local. So here's my local file. So now we have two options as we're working. We can save to the local file, which you should do, you know, every 10 minutes. Revit is actually more stable than AutoCAD. True story. So whenever I'm working with AutoCAD with a group of users, we have more crashes than we do with Revit. Revit will crash once in a while, but it's like a 10-to-1 ratio. I kid you not. So now we've got a save button. So here, let me just put it up on my quick access toolbar here. Okay, so what you'll have typically on your quick access toolbar is you'll see your save icon up there, and you will see your synchronize with central icon. And they're right beside each other, right up by the little R on the quick access toolbar. So on your collaborate tab, you've got the synchronize with central button. So sync with central down here on the Revit is the same as the smaller version of it up on the quick access toolbar there up at the top right. So now you have two choices. You can hit the little anachronistic save icon. So that's your Control S, right? Just like saving a word processing document, Control S to save. That means that you are saving from RAM to your local file. You do that every 10 minutes. Now, you'll also be able to save your changes that you've been working on to the central file on your office's server. So we call this synchronize with central. So at that time, your changes go up the pipe to the central file, and other users' changes come back down to you. So with synchronize with central, it's two ways. Your changes go up, their changes come back down to you. So you won't see any other changes that people have done as you're working away. So if someone makes a big change in your project, you don't see it until you sync with Central. So at that moment then, other folks will see your changes, after they synchronize, of course. But you will see other people's changes when you synchronize. So that's one way of getting up to date. Another way of getting up to date is on the Collaborate tab here, you'll see Reload Latest. So what the Reload Latest button does is it pulls new changes down from the central file. So whereas Synchronizer Central is a two-way process, Reload Latest just pulls down all the changes that have happened in the central file to your currently open model. Now, keep in mind that when you sync with Central or your Reload Latest, you're not updating your local file. You're just opening, you're editing, you're updating the project that you have opened up and around, right? Because it's not until you hit Control S and save your local file that these updates would be saved into your local file. So of course, if you're working on your local file, nothing's being changed on that data on your disk until you hit save. Everything right now is just happening in computer memory. So that's a good distinction to make. So, two-way, sync with Central, updates with Reload Latest. That's just a one-way update. Now, how does Revit prevent two people from making the same change at the same time? Well, in the background, Revit is always talking to the central file. And when I say always, I'm talking probably hundreds of times per second. Like, there's a lot of noise on your network. IT specialists that I've worked with have often commented, and they said that Revit is a very chatty program. Okay. But Revit talks a lot from your currently open session of Revit. It's talking a lot to the central file. So I think they call it polling. This is polling the central file. So why? Well, because Revit is keeping track of who has started to work on a 2D or 3D object in the project. So if I go in and look at one of the objects in a floor plan, and I click on something like a wall or a door, here, I just need to relinquish everything here. You're going to see these little puzzle piece icons that are going to appear on each one of the objects, whether it's a piece of text or a door or what have you. And so there it is right there. You can see it's that little puzzle piece icon. If any of you guys played video games in the 1980s, it kind of reminds me of Qubit, that old game with the guy with the little elephant nose. He used to jump around between all the little boxes. So it kind of looks like that. What that little icon means is that you don't have access to that object. It means you can't edit it. But as soon as you click on it, now it's yours. And in fact, you don't even have to click on that icon. If I wanted to make a change with where this wall is sitting, I just grab the move command and move it. And as soon as you grab an object and you make a change to it, moving it, changing its properties, what have you, Revit immediately gives control of that object, sole control, to you and you alone. So what Revit is doing when people are grabbing these objects and making changes with them is that Revit is keeping track of who has signed these objects out on a first come, first serve basis. Now, when you folks go to Save to Central, what Revit is doing is it relinquishes those objects that you've been working on and gives them back to the team. So, when you folks hit that Save to Central button, whether it's Synchronize with Central or Synchronize with Central and Modify Settings, both those dialog boxes do the same thing. Or both those commands, rather. But the one that shows you the dialog box has the little check boxes in it, so you can see what it is you're actually relinquishing to the team when you do that Synchronize with Central. So, I said that Revit is very chatty, and so you remember that little puzzle piece qubit icon thing that I was clicking on the walls, or if you just grab a piece of text and move it, grab a dimension and move it. Each time you touch something in Revit, Revit immediately talks to the central file and says that whatever my Windows username is, or my Revit username, it says that W. Macaulay has those objects. And if you folks went in the next millisecond to try and make a change to that object, you couldn't. So Revit is first come, first served. Until you do a Save to Central, and then everything goes back into the team and it's a free-for-all. Now if you make a change to an object and you do a Save to Central, you may have another person in your office who's working on their own local file. So you've got the other person in your office who's wanting to get that same object that you've been working on. And so they're like, hey, can I get that wall? I need to make some changes to that wall. And you're like, okay. So you do a Save to Central, and that wall that you've been working on gets relinquished back to the team. But then, that other person also has to either do a Synchronize with Central or a Reload Latest, so that they can see where that latest location of the wall is, or whatever changes that you've made. You can't just hand over control of an object in your office to somebody else. You have to do a Save to Central, and they have to do a Save to Central, so that they can get access to those objects that you've changed. So that's just something you have to be aware of. There's lots of saving to Central that has to happen in these offices as you're passing control of these objects from one person to the next. So let's look at some of the terminology here at the bottom of page 1. So a work set, what a work set really is, it's kind of a jargon word, and I don't particularly like the word. But in the work sets dialog box here, you can see that there's these check boxes for the different kinds of work sets in the bottom of the dialog box. So all of the geometry in your project, the 3D geometry, is stored in these so-called user-created work sets. So what they simply are, it's just a bucket of data in your database. So if you think of all the data that's in your particular central file, about 80% of your Revit file is 3D geometry. So if you have a 100 meg file, like 80% of that is 3D data, and then the other 20% is the 2D and other stuff. So you folks are responsible for creating the work sets for 3D objects, and you can create as many or as few work sets as you want. If you didn't want to create any work sets except the ones that Revit makes when you start a project, that's fine. But there's good reasons to create more work sets than that, and we'll talk about those later. So we've got this other column here called Work Set Owner. Now what this means is you have exclusive control of every object in that work set. So this column says owner of me for the building exterior work set, that means none of you plebs get to work in that work set at all. I have supreme control. This is bad, right? It means that it locks all of you folks out of the dialog box. So that's not something that we want to see. But if I have grabbed an object here on the exterior and I've just done to make some edits on some of the walls in this, or objects in this exterior work set, when I go back and look at the work sets dialog box, it lists me as a borrower. So it means I've grabbed a few objects in that work set, and next time I do a save to central, Revit will relinquish those 3D objects back to the team. Now there's other kinds of work sets here. There's work sets for views. So each time that you folks create a new view, Revit creates a new work set for that view. So what do these work sets contain? Well, if you folks remember from the intro course, we told you that views contain all of the 2D objects. So your view work sets contain all the 2D geometry, the text, the room tags, dimensions. All that data is stored in these work sets. You don't have to worry about creating them. You don't have to worry about managing them. And if you see yourself as a borrower in one of these views, it simply means that you've got some 2D objects in that view that you've been working with. And again, you don't have to worry about your view work sets. Revit takes care of those for you. So the only ones that you have to manage are these user-created work sets. Okay, over to page 2. So once you have enabled work sets on your project, there is a flyout menu at the bottom of the screen which shows you what the current work set is. So it's totally like setting a layer current in AutoCAD. So, you know, set your building exterior work set current and boom, any object that you draw from this point forward will be in that work set. You can, of course, have the wrong work set current. Not really a big deal. So here I can click on this wall, and I'm going to make another wall just like this one. Where is create similar? There we go. Okay, so here's a new exterior wall, which I have accidentally placed onto the building interior work set. So after you've placed some objects in your project, if you put them on the wrong work set, if you go and find the object's properties, work set is a setting here so you can move it to the right layer. It's really just like that. What is the upshot of putting these objects on the wrong work set? Not much really. It just means that if you go to turn your interior work set off, if you're going to do that when you were printing, potentially that wall could get hidden and you'd be able to see inside your building. So that's kind of the worst case scenario. Now of course it's really easy, right? I can right click and say select all instances in the project, so I'm grabbing every single exterior wall of this kind in the project. So there you go, I've grabbed them all, and all in one go I can put them onto the right work set. Right? That's a really easy way to make sure objects are sitting on the right work set. Now Revit shows you this little bit of text here at the bottom. It says the name of the work set, and then it says not editable. Well, does that mean I can't change anything? No. What it means is that in the work sets dialog box, you're not the owner. That's terrible. Really, it should just say, you know, owner here, and then down at the bottom, instead of not editable, it should say not owned, because we don't want to own a work set. So anyways, just ignore it. And in fact, if you ever saw one of your work sets in here and it didn't have not editable at the end of it, that would actually be bad, right? Because if I went into work sets and say I'd say took the building exterior here and I make it editable, that means I own it. So now the building exterior doesn't show that annoying, not editable text at the end of it, but it also means that none of you could edit any of these objects in that work set because I've made it editable by me. Now, Revit is relatively new software, but this editable business comes from when Revit was a younger piece of software, and by younger I mean 2005. Okay, and here's the deal. So back in 2005, the way it worked was you could all collaborate on a project, but everybody had to have their own work set. So if there were 6 of us working on a job, we'd have to have at least six work sets, and you'd have to kind of divvy the project up. Maybe you had a work set called floors, and you had someone who was doing all the floors, and then you had another work set called partitions, and somebody else was working on the partitions. And the way it worked was that everybody could work on the job, but only at one work set at a time. So work sets were really important in the early days of Revit. And now they're still here, and we use them as we're going to discuss tonight, but it's not on a per user basis. You don't need one work set per user. But so all of this stuff that you see here, the editable at the bottom, not editable down here, it's throwback stuff. So unfortunately, that stuff is still in there in Revit, so now at least you understand what that stuff means. Now, creating work sets, second half of page 2 here. So when you are in the work sets dialog box, there's a button up here so that you can create a new work set. Now you'll notice that there is a button here that says visible in all views, and you'll notice that some of these work sets don't have that checked. So here, when you create the new work set, you can decide at this point if you want it to be visible in all views. Now, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you want a work set to be visible in all views? Well, let's take interior finishes. So if you're working in a firm where interior designers and architects are working on the same file, the interior designers can be laying out the floor finishes and carpets, tiles, all of that stuff. Things which we don't want to see necessarily in the architectural floor plans. So we might keep all that stuff turned on. Okay, that's cool. So in my architectural floor plans, on the Work Sets tab, here it says Interior Finishes, use global setting, not visible. So when it says use global setting, it means what does Work Sets say? Well, for interior finishes, it's not visible in all views. By default, this work set is hidden. So in that case, the interior designers in the floor finishes plan can turn on that work set for this view. So all the lovely GM tiles can be shown in this view, but in the architectural floor plans where this would be a huge distraction, they don't even have to worry about turning that work set off because in the work sets dialog box, it is off by default. So when I go to visibility for this view, the work set for my interior finishes is off. If I want to show it, I go into this dialog box and I ask Revit to show it. So now this work set will appear. And there it is. So that's the purpose of whether you want to have a work set hidden or shown by default. Okay, over to page 3. Now a lot of this here we've talked about already. Save local, synchronize now, synchronize and modify settings, and reload latest. And we talked about how Revit keeps track of who has what signed out. So each object in Revit, whether it's a piece of text or a 3D object, each one of these has its own number in the Revit database. Now, I think AutoCAD calls them handles, which is terrible. Revit just calls it an ID. So if you click on an object and you go to the Manage tab, I think. Manage? Yes, Manage. Over on the inquiry panel here, you've got a couple of buttons. And it's this one here, ID of selection. And so if I say pick on a wall and I go to Manage and then ID of selection. This is the unique number. So what is that? 1360347. That's the unique number of this object in the Revit database. Every single piece of text, every single 3D object, every single 2D object has its own number. So Revit just keeps counting up and up and up and up and up and up as you make your project bigger. And so when I grab an object and I start working with it, AutoCAD says, hey, Wes has object blah, blah, blah signed out. It's his. Nobody else gets to touch it until Wes does a save to central and I relinquish those borrowed objects back to the central file and back to the team. Now, in the event that somebody else wants to grab a file, or grab an object from you, rather. So you've grabbed an object, you've made some modifications to it, you've moved it, you've changed what wall type it is, you put a door in it. So if you put a door in a wall, you get to, you know, you're the exclusive user of that door and that wall until you save the central. So if you need to get access from your colleague for an object, you'll see a little dialog box here on page 3. It's the bottom of the 4 little screenshots that you see there, and it says editing, request, receive. So often when you're working with your colleagues in Revit, especially if they're on a different floor in your office and they can't like yell at you, you'll see these little notifications that'll float up on your screen in about a second. Because what will happen is if you click on an object and it's got the little puzzle icon, or you start moving it and you can't, so you're trying to move a wall or something like that, and it says wall is being used by user whatever his name is, and then it'll say request access. There'll be a little button there that you can click and says request access. And about 2 seconds after you hit that button, the colleague who's working with that object will have that little dialog box that's kind of float up onto their screen, and it says grant or deny. So in that case, they can give you the object, but they'll probably have to do a save to central anyway. So that way at least users in your office will know when somebody else wants to get access to an object that they're working with. And this will happen with 2D objects and 3D objects. That dialog box is the same for both of them. So, typical 3D work sets that I'm going to recommend for when you're working on a project. Building exterior, building interior, the shared levels and grids one that comes out of the box, site and structure, and one for your linked Revit models, and one for imported CAD files from your consultants. So that's kind of a good starting list for your work sets. Okay, so we'll take a break for 10 minutes and we'll come back and talk about what you would use work sets for.